Welcome to Inside the Mask, the podcast where we cover off all your favorite horror movies with a true crime twist. New Year's themed horror movies are pretty slim pickings out there. So for our first New Year's special, we're covering a 1980s era slasher that starred Scream Queen Jamie Lee Curtis, a few years after her breakout hit with Halloween and the same year that she would also star in Prom Night. It's the story of a group of university students who, a year after a hazing prank goes terribly wrong, find themselves picked off one by a many-masked killer during a New Year's Eve costume party. But to keep things interesting, this end-of-year outing is taking place on a moving train, meaning the occupants have nowhere to run and no means of escape. Has one of the students descended into a murderous rampage, maybe buckling under the pressures of a busy exam season? Or has this now infamous dorm room prank come back to haunt these students, only this time with deadly consequences? I'm your host, Evan Taggart, and this is Terror Train. It's a snowy New Year's Eve in 1980, and the students at Northern Illinois University in Chicago are ready to end the year in a truly over-the-top fashion. Members of the local fraternity and sorority houses band together to throw what many consider to be a themed costume party. And if you can believe it, have actually rented a moving locomotive as the hosting site of this party itself. Now, this party on wheels was hosted by Steam Train Excursions, a local tourist attraction, and the idea to hold this event at this unique setting was concocted by a student and future murder victim who was nicknamed Doc by his friends, no doubt from his prominent position in medical studies at the university. Purchase records show that Doc paid for the majority of this event, and surviving victim and witness statements indicate he also planned the majority of the party itself. Now, Doc's parties at the university seem to have quite a bit of a notoriety among the students and the faculty, and it's often said that they typically ended in some kind of an immature hazing prank, or, quite frankly, not in the most favorable fashion. And this New Year's costume party would prove to be no different. Only this time, in the confines of this moving train, the consequences would be deadly, famously resulting in the mass murder of multiple students and staff who were on board at the time. The varied victims of the massacre on Train 1881 would mostly be located within the train crime scene itself, though some were assumed to have been disposed of through various methods, as the killer attempted to conceal his own identity throughout the evening, likely to maximize his own body count. While there would be many random victims, seemingly the result of an almost collateral damage, the killer's true targets are deemed by police to have been a group of close friends who attended the university altogether. There was surviving victim Alana Maxwell, her female best friend Mitchie, their respective boyfriends Mo and the aforementioned Doc, as well as their other male friends Ed and Jackson. And when the identity of the masked killer is finally revealed, the connection he shared with this group of friends, showcasing the motive behind these killings, proves to be truly disturbing. The first body discovered in the case was actually located by authorities not on the train, but rather at the train station where the locomotive departed on its journey. Specifically, the body of fraternity member and student Ed is found sprawled across the train tracks. He was found to be only partially clothed, a fact that investigators would later theorize was attributed to the killer stealing Ed's costume, and thereby assuming his identity to board and travel the train unnoticed. Crime scene photographs are extremely graphic here, showcasing what appears to be a case of the students somehow falling under the wheels of the moving train as it left the station. Now, investigators initially believed this to be some kind of a tragic accident, as toxicology shows, similar to many victims in the case, that Ed had been consuming alcohol and possibly recreational drugs at the time of his death, and it was assumed at first that he might have actually fallen under the train unnoticed by his peers. However, a formal autopsy report reveals another interesting fact here. While there was indeed extensive trauma to Ed's body that was caused by the crushing power of the train itself, his torso had a single puncture wound just under his right rib cage that police indicate could not have been caused by the train. Now, witness statements also indicate that prior to boarding taking place, Ed was seen seemingly brandishing a prop sword through the torso of his body, a sight that was at the time assumed to have been another one of his many pranks that he had become known for among his students and peers. However, given the results of the subsequent autopsy, it's possible and quite probable that Ed was not a victim of circumstance here, and in fact was the first murder victim in the reported 10 murders that would take place over the course of that New Year's Eve. Now at this point, the train has departed on its New Year's journey, and both the passengers and the crew are unknowingly harboring this killer in question. The second murder in the series of killings would be reportedly discovered by lead train conductor Carney. His log notes indicate that at some point later in the evening, Carney performs a wellness check on one of the locked lavatories in one of the train cars. Fearing somebody may have passed out or may be in need of medical attention, when he opens the door, he instead finds something truly shocking. Sprawled out on the bathroom floor is the body of a costumed passenger, later identified by police as most likely that of fraternity member Jackson, who university transcripts confirm he had recently completed a 4-year program at NIU. Though his body wasn't actually recovered, which we'll touch on in more detail shortly, traces of his blood were found in the crime scene itself, despite the fact that the killer had meticulously tried to conceal this evidence. At the time of the discovery of Jackson's body, he was found to have been wearing a lizard or dinosaur costume that, according to numerous witness statements, he was seen wearing throughout the night on various occasions. Now, this information leads police to believe that it was indeed Jackson who was found dead in the bathroom initially. But when the responding engineering team of Train 1881 would return to secure the crime scene mere moments later, they make an even more bizarre discovery. This victim in question is apparently alive. And even further, the extensive blood reported on the scene by conductor Carney is now completely gone. An empty liquor bottle nearby suggests to the crew that this lizard-suited individual may have actually just simply fallen over drunk, a trend that was no doubt quite common in the elaborate New Year's party atmosphere on board. So the crew, thinking that there was no murder that took place and that Carney might have been mistaken in what he saw, then ushers this costume person back into the party in a crowded area of the train. And controversially, they do so without actually checking the identity of the individual inside the mask. Now, it would be a costly decision that would lead to even more deaths on board the train. In reality, this lizard or dinosaur man was the costumed killer himself, who had managed to switch into Jackson's costume and clean up the crime scene before responding staff made it back to the lavatory. Now, police later confirmed this theory was likely when it was reported that a bloody cloth is discovered stashed away under the sink in the bathroom itself, with DNA samples matching that of probable victim Jackson. It's theorized by investigators that Jackson's body was likely thrown from the moving train, a common disposal method that was possibly used with various other victims in the case. And due to the vast and varied terrain, coupled with the fact that there's really no clear timeline of when Jackson may have been killed, recovery of his body proved to be impossible. Now, it's important to note here, as it's often questioned and criticized by media and beyond, the crew of Locomotive 1881 did attempt to stop and possibly even reverse the train as soon as Jackson's body was discovered. However, due to the structure of the railway itself, which was a single track instead of a dual track as is common in modern locomotive railways, it would have taken a significant amount of time to travel in reverse all the way back to their point of origin, and it was suggested that they instead could likely arrive at their destination to report the crime to police much faster. It's also important to mention that at the time that these murders took place, many critics, after the events became known to the public, questioned why conductor Carney or any member of his crew failed to reach out to their dispatch or to police authorities to report the happenings on board. However, reports in subsequent interviews with the station dispatch associate Maggie Anderson confirmed that due to a cost-cutting measure that would prove both dangerous and disastrous, radio communications on the locomotive were actually non-functional, as the management team at Steam Train Excursions were reportedly attempting to recoup from various financial losses. Now, this negligence would lead to much scrutiny of the organization, as well as potential lawsuits following the massacre. The lack of radio equipment, combined with the one-way design of the train tracks, ensured that in the chaos to follow, there would be no means of escape or retreat, and simply no way to call for help. Now at this point, the killer is back among the crowds in the train, having been unknowingly ushered back to potential and future murder victims by the train crew. And it wouldn't be long before the next body is discovered on board. University student Mitchie's corpse is found by staff on the locomotive, having been stashed inside one of the bunks in the sleeping quarters train car. Extensive blood patterns on the fabrics of the bedspread are attributed to Mitchie herself. An autopsy shows that her throat was slashed by a sharp object, though the murder weapon itself was not actually recovered. While the party-going students scattered across the various train cars are mostly oblivious to the dangers within, it's here that Conductor Carney is sure that there is a killer on board, and that it may in fact be the same person who was pretending to be the lizard-costumed Jackson earlier in the evening. It's also here that surviving victim Alana Maxwell testifies that she became aware of the violent events on the train herself, having stumbled onto the discovery of her friend Mitchie's body, which sends her into an understandable frenzied hysteria. And as the rest of the students continue to celebrate with copious amounts of alcohol and on-site entertainment at the hands of a local magician, the next victim would shortly be discovered. It's unclear exactly when murder victim Mo was killed during the evening. Now, reports seem to indicate that some surviving students may have actually seen him wandering the train cars in the hour or so prior to his body being found. But he was discovered unresponsive during the aforementioned magic show that was being performed in one of the train cars. Initially thought by his friends to have been passed out from alcohol consumption, a closer inspection of his body reveals that he's actually been stabbed numerous times in the stomach and the chest, resulting in massive blood loss and internal trauma. In spite of being transported to a nearby car for medical attention, Mo is actually pronounced dead by the crew on site after a brief attempt at revival. While the fifth and sixth bodies would not actually be recovered, assumed to again have been thrown overboard after their murder, the victims in this case are assumed to be that of the remaining crewmen who were piloting and operating the train. They're generally deemed to be collateral damage, but it's also possible that this was an attempt to thwart any efforts to plot a new course and alter the murderer's yet-to-be-known master plans. Now, it's assumed that these two victims were murdered when articles of their clothing were discovered in the staffing cart, including bloodstains on one of the lead engineer's hats. Now, at this point in the evening, the remaining crew of Train 1881 decides to make a bold move in the hopes of preventing further murders and to also potentially identify the killer. You have to remember that this is a train full of masked and costumed individuals, so at this point the murderer could really have been any one of them hiding in disguise. Conductor Carney reports that he triggered the locomotive's emergency brake system, causing the entire train to come to a complete and abrupt stop in the middle of the surrounding freezing landscape. And in spite of the pleas and confusion from the students, many of whom assumed this was some kind of a fraternity prank, the crew orders the entire passenger count of the train outdoors, where they're instructed to unmask and identify themselves. Now, this plan reportedly does work to a degree, except for one major detail. The killer doesn't seem to be among the students outside, or at least it would appear that way on the surface. Now, the truth would soon prove to be an unexpected twist. Surviving victim Alana Maxwell told police that at some point she began to suspect that this killer was deliberately targeting her specifically, as well as very pointedly her own close friends from school. Now, when questioned as to why she might have felt this way, she reveals that 3 years prior to the event, during a party hosted at the fraternity house, this group of friends played a hazing prank, again something that they had a bit of a reputation for, on one of the pre-med students at the university. Now, at the hands of the fraternity member Doc, who would later be the victim of a violent murder on board Train 1881, this prank proves to go a little too far. It's reported by Alana that what was supposed to be a bait-and-switch dating gag that would result in the humiliation of a fraternity pledge named Kenny Hampson took a turn for the truly grotesque, as the frat house gang staged an actual dead cadaver that was stolen from the school medical ward as Kenny's blind date. Now, this joke, unsurprisingly, had a massive impact on Kenny psychologically, who unwittingly found himself locked in a bedroom with this unidentified corpse specimen. And as a result of this prank, he was reported to have suffered a complete mental collapse. Numerous detailed records indicate that shortly after this hazing fiasco, Kenny Hampson dropped out of school, and was admitted to a psychiatric care facility where it was also documented that he may have in fact already had extensive medical records, indicating mental and psychological trauma. And while other reports can't actually be confirmed, it was rumored among the staff that he might have actually been involved, though possibly inadvertently, in the murder of an unidentified individual at some point before his eventual release. It's here that Alana Maxwell draws the connection that was later confirmed and appropriated by police that the killer must be Kenny Hampson, who is specifically targeting those who played this life-altering prank on him so many years ago, using a scenario that he must have known that they would have been unable to escape from. And Alana also theorizes that Kenny may be operating under the guise of the hired entertainment act of the evening, the mysterious magician whose own real name and identity has remained a mystery to the students and crew on board. And while Alana's head was in the right place with this theory, given that the magician was around the same age as Kenny Hampson might have been, and he had free reign to roam any car that he so chose, it would turn out that, as is the case with an actual magic trick, she was, in fact, being misdirected, and the killer's chosen disguise was even more surprising after all. Now, the crew of Train 1881 decide to attempt to complete the journey to reach police assistance, and they load the passengers back into the train, hoping to reach the end of the line before more murders can occur. But these violent killings were far from over. Serial killer Kenny Hampson would claim 4 more victims before New Year's Eve would be through. One unidentified student was found murdered in an otherwise empty train car, their cause of death ultimately inconclusive in autopsy. One of the train's staff, by the name of Chief Porter Dunley, was also discovered dead in the dining car, having been stabbed through the torso with a prop sword that police were able to formally recover intact, as it was left protruding from his fatal wound by the killer. The killer's next victim is perhaps one of the most prominent and surely one of the most violent and aggressive murders in the entire Locomotive 1881 killing spree itself. The body of fraternity member Doc was first discovered by his own peers, but eventually would be recovered by responding investigators. Doc was completely decapitated, with his body stuffed into an overhead compartment within one of the rooms in a luxury car on the train. Now, the space itself was completely coated in Doc's blood that was confirmed by DNA samples, indicating that a potentially violent altercation took place prior to his murder. When interviewed by police, survivor Alana Maxwell stated that at some point after the train again departed on its journey, both she and Doc secured themselves in that same room that would become the crime scene. After Doc reportedly became aggressive and potentially violent himself, no doubt in a state of paranoia and shock over the events, Alana decided to leave the room, fearing for her own safety. Now it would be the last time that she saw Doc alive. Behavioral experts here typically agree that the excessively violent nature to Doc's murder at the hands of Kenny Hampson was likely due to Doc's first-hand involvement in the hazing prank that would become Kenny's primary trauma trigger. It would be the same trigger that would eventually prove to be his own downfall. Now, the next victim discovered by police would actually disprove a portion of Alana Maxwell's theory on the identity of the then-unknown killer, as the body in question is none other than the unnamed magician himself. This entertainer is found grotesquely concealed within one of his own magic trick contraptions. His cause of death is determined to be from numerous penetrative wounds at the hands of his own prop swords, the same swords that were theorized to have been used in other murders on the train, in a possible attempt by the killer to cast suspicion on this magician himself in the case that the actual killer had managed to eventually escape. Now, this attempt would prove to be ultimately useless, as according to Alana's impact statements, it wouldn't be long before the killer was formally revealed, and the case would come to a surprising conclusion. At some point before their final confrontation, Alana was heavily pursued by this masked killer through various cars on the train. She fought bravely to stave him off and managed to do so successfully after numerous very physical altercations. However, the two would eventually come face to face in the staff quarters of the locomotive, where in one last-ditch effort to disguise himself, Kenny Hampson had obtained the outfit of one of the crew members, possibly that of the deceased Porter Dunley, or the then-missing brakeman Charlie. Witness statements indicate that Kenny Hampson had, in fact, been hiding in plain sight, during the duration of the New Year's Eve costume party on the train. Only it wasn't as the magician. It was instead as the magician's own female assistant. Serial killer Kenny Hampson had assumed a completely alternate persona, outfitted with a wig and an unrecognizable attire, even altering his own voice. And police theorize that coupled with his own assumed costume disguises of his victims throughout the night, this would have no doubt made identifying him nearly impossible. It's surmised by investigators that Alana's theory about Kenny wanting revenge for the university hazing prank was at least partially true, that it was likely the primary driver for him to commit these violent acts on the passengers and the crew of Train 1881. However, in her appeals to Kenny for the horrible joke 3 years prior, Alana reportedly triggers some kind of a mental lapse. And as such, both she and conductor Carney are able to successfully subdue this killer in question, wherein during a physical altercation, they manage to eject him from the moving train. Kenny Hampson was killed from extensive impact trauma as his body hit the icy terrain some 50 feet below the moving high-speed locomotive. Though the recovery of his body would prove to be difficult due to the terrain and icy conditions, the specificity of his death location helped investigators locate his corpse after the fact, given that he fell in a prominent river in the area. While there were thankfully many survivors in the massacre on Train 1881, there was actually only one survivor of the primary targets of serial killer Kenny Hampson. Alana Maxwell would go on to provide extensive statements to police detailing the events that night, as well as her own admittance of her involvement in the hazing prank that would prove to be the inciting incident of these crimes. And while her statements offered little closure to the impacted victims of Kenny Hampson's heinous crimes, they do, at least in part, provide some kind of insight into the killer's own motives, enabling police to complete their investigation full steam ahead. Thanks for listening to our true crime spin on Terror Train. I'd heard a lot about this movie given that there is not a heck of a lot of New Year's themed horrors out there, but I'd actually never seen it in full until covering it for the podcast. At first I wasn't really sure if I liked it at all, to be honest. The movie spends what seems to be an absurd amount of time showcasing the magician's magic show, which ultimately just serves to be a red herring that's just obvious as hell, man. Plus, the magician is played by famous real-life magic man David Copperfield. So I don't know if the studio just wanted to milk the heck out of that or what was going on there, to be honest. There's literally at least probably 15 to 20 minutes of just a magic show in this movie. Literally just watching a magic show. However, all the magic stuff aside, it does have some fun elements to it. The killer constantly changing outfits was pretty cool, and the idea of a slasher on a train is actually a pretty unique setting. Some of the characters actually break convention here and there as well, which is always refreshing, particularly conductor Carney, who in many other movies would be that annoying character in denial about the murders taking place, and only thinking of his own well-being or the well-being of the company. You know the type, like the mayor in Jaws, that freaking jerk. Anyway, the movie's currently on a few platforms if you're curious, and if you're a fan of 70s or 80s era slashers, it might be worth a watch. I wouldn't really put it on your New Year's resolution list though. It's worth noting that they remade this movie on Prime in 2022, and followed up with a sequel in 2024, but I haven't seen either of those, so I can't really comment if they're any good or not. I also want to take a moment to wish all of our listeners a happy new year. I genuinely hope that 2025 is just amazing for each and every one of you. We might launch our first ever bonus episode content in January, offering some insights into the facts and Easter eggs that go into the podcast episodes themselves, as it's something I get asked about quite often. So be on the lookout for that, in addition to our regular content every Tuesday. Until next time, I'm your host Evan Taggart, and this has been Inside the Mask.